This is, I know, kind of funny to be using this, but this is also for the benefit of people who might listen to the recording of this. Welcome to the Chicago Style Documentation Workshop. I'm Michelle Rowe-Gigannon. I direct the Writing Center. We have a very small group tonight, but you will be benefiting from the knowledge that is here tonight on Chicago Style expertise. If you need help with writing, of course, for distance students, you can submit writing in the online Writing Center in D2L or request a Skype appointment, wcenter@usd.edu. And on-campus students can come to the Writing Center in room 133 of Ivy Week's library. So our next workshop, and I'm looking to, this is the sheet, to remind me, the next workshop is Understanding and Using Social Media, which should be a very interesting workshop because people are confused about social media in the era of fake news websites and so on and so forth. So I encourage you to attend. All right, without further ado, Professor Lampert has graciously volunteered to lead this workshop for us. Please give her your complete attention.
Thank you. Okay, so this is a workshop on Chicago style focused primarily on documentation, on the notes and bibliography form of documentation. So we are drawing on, welcome, we're drawing on the 17th edition of the Chicago Manual of Style. Much of the content of these slides is drawn directly from the manual. If you have any questions, you're welcome to contact me. If you need, my email is right here. So today we're going to talk about why Chicago style, talk a little bit about citing and quoting basics, and focus mostly on footnoting and bibliography basics. I put a couple resources in this slide here for you to use. So the chicagomanualstyle.org has the complete guide online. If you log in, you can get a free trial. If you're finishing up a research paper or project, that might be worth doing. Otherwise, I recommend using the quick guide. No login is required. It's the resource that I go to when I'm working on my citations and I'm trying to remember how to do something. So this would be the chicagomanualstyle.org homepage. You click Citation Quick Guide, which brings you to this site, which will show you the format that you can mirror. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that today, but I want to make sure that you know this resource because it's really, really phenomenal. So Chicago style is favored by scholars in the humanities, primarily historians, literary scholars who also use Chicago, and scholars in the arts. And so one of the differences between Chicago and other citation styles is its emphasis. So we say that Chicago emphasizes the origins of a source because really what you're doing is your research is your sources. And so you want to show that research in the way you cite your primary and secondary research materials. As opposed to MLA citation style, which emphasizes authorship, though you may be aware that there is a form of MLA that also does use footnoting. An APA citation style emphasizes the date of information creation. What we're trying to do in Chicago style is to show the sources we're using, show their origins, and also provide sometimes additional commentary on those sources. One of the big things that we don't do in Chicago style is use parentheticals. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. That's a common pitfall that we see in a lot of student papers. So what are some other features of Chicago style? So when writing in Chicago style, you want to cite the sources of direct quotations and paraphrases, and of any facts or opinions not generally known or easily checked. So the question you want to ask yourself is, what am I drawing on to make this claim? Cite it. When in doubt, cite it. You want your citation information to your readers that they can directly locate those sources or have a reasonable ability to know where they're found. So if you're drawing on archival material, that may not be readily accessible to your readers, they should know that if they contact that archive, that material will be there. It's reasonable that someone could access it. And ostensibly, someone should be able to duplicate your research from your citations. Though obviously they may come to completely different conclusions, but that's the premise. All citations should appear in the bibliography at the end of a text. So just having your footnotes or your endnotes is not enough. You want to always have a bibliography or works cited page. So what I want to walk through are some of those components a little bit more slowly, and I want to encourage anyone to ask me questions at any time. There'll be questions at the end, but at any point stop me if there's anything that you'd like clarification on. So choosing when to cite, so we cite for a number of reasons. We're placing ourselves in a scholarly conversation, so we want to show the scholarship that we're drawing upon. As you become more advanced in your work, you may make a few sentence claims and then cite 4 or 5 scholars upon which that general knowledge is based. But when you're writing a research paper, you may be mostly working from a more limited set of sources, and we'll cite one source in a footnote. But there are a range of ways you can use footnotes to elaborate on your text. But the point here is that you want to give credit to who you're drawing upon. And so, again, when in doubt, cite those sources. Commonly known or readily reliable facts that can be stated without quotation or attribution do not require a citation. But the question I think you need to always ask yourself is, where is what I'm writing coming from? If you're reading something and drawing closely upon it, you want to cite it. And you also want to really make sure that you're not inadvertently plagiarizing by duplicating the phrasing of the source that you are using. A good rule of thumb or rather a good strategy for avoiding that pitfall is to not write directly from the sources you're using if you're working from secondary sources, but to take notes on them, step back, and then write from that, because you're less likely to inadvertently plagiarize. Okay, I think that's a really a good strategy. So at the bottom of the slide, you see a list of statements and this actually comes from Chicago Manual. And so the first set of statements don't require a citation. It does. Why? Why do we think that is? What does the bottom statement contain that none of the other ones do? A direct quote, right, exactly. It's a direct quote. Now you'll notice that the statement above is stylistically evoking Francis Bacon, but it's not actually drawing upon, it's evoking Shakespeare's commentary on Francis Bacon, but it's not actually drawing upon Shakespeare, right? So most of the examples above are things that are reasonable knowledge that can be ascertained, general facts that are not based on close research. I want to talk a little bit about quoting and how to quote, because this is another common pitfall that also affects how students are thinking about citation as well. So one of the things that is worth keeping in mind is that when your professors want you to quote sources, we want you to quote sources because we want you to draw upon that material and engage with it in a meaningful way. And part of the art of quoting is figuring out, how do I situate what I find interesting or important in a source in my own words? One of the most important parameters of quoting is a quote should rarely stand alone. If you find yourself writing a sentence and then ending the sentence and putting in a quote, that may be a red flag that you're not fully integrating that quote into your own narrative and arguments. And so Chicago offers us some guidance for how to incorporate quotes into a text. So you want to phrase the surrounding text in such a way that the quoted words fit into it logically and grammatically, as if there were no quotation marks. What that also allows you to do is help set up the most important pieces of your quote and start and or finish a thought around that quote. A good rule of thumb is you really never want to start and end a sentence with a quote, right? There should be your words on either side of it and ideally on both sides of it. So again, a general guide for effective quoting. You may, sometimes when you're integrating quotes into your writing, you may make occasional adjustments to the original. And so when you're choosing the quotes you want to work into your writing, try to find out what's the most important piece of this. Why am I quoting this? What is it about this that's important? And try to integrate that rather than simply take it and plop it into your writing. So that's a general guide for thinking about quoting. And so what you see here in this example, also from the Chicago Guide, is a quote, and then how the writer integrates the most important pieces of that quote into the writer's own arguments about it. And notice the writer is pulling out pieces, okay? And that is, not only is that okay to do, it's actually ideal. So any questions about that? I don't want to move too fast, but I want to make sure we have time to workshop as well. Yes?
Do you always need like a page number if you're like paraphrasing something? Do you have to put like a specific page number that you're paraphrasing the information from, or do you only need a page number if you're quoting?
You should, if you are drawing on a particular passage and you have a page number, use a page number. So one of the things that we'll do often as historians is do what's known as a bibliographic citation, where we'll talk about a field of scholarship, or we'll talk about a line of argument. And in that citation, you may list several books that you're drawing upon. And that's a case where you wouldn't necessarily put page numbers. However, if I'm making a claim about something that comes from a piece of scholarship, I should be able to locate that claim in the text. And then when I locate that claim in the text that I'm drawing upon, that I'm discussing in my own work, I should then have a page number for it, right? And I will say that as you write, you may not always put those page numbers in, but that's why you want to go back, right? And double check, right? Always double check and say, you know, I made that point and I cited that book and I know that point's in that book. Let me see where it is. Let me make sure that it's there. And then in making sure, you find that page number and you put it in. So here are two examples of student work that integrates quotes really effectively. And so what I want to point out to you is how in integrating these quotes, what both of these writers do is they set up the quotes in such a way that you're aware of what they are related to, what they are about. So in the first example, we identify the ships that are being described, and we have a narrative about them, and then the quote finishes the sentence, okay? Same thing. In the second quote, we have the setup of a story about Deborah Sampson, and then the quote follows. And you'll notice that the writer has removed text from the quote in that second quote and put an ellipses. And that ellipses is a sign that the writer has pulled text out in order to focus on the components of the quote that are most central to what they want to convey from this primary source. Now, it is understood when you're quoting that you're pulling text out, so you don't need to use ellipses at the beginning or the end. You want to use ellipses when you remove text from the middle. One other thing to notice about these, and we'll talk about this more, is the placement of the superscript footnote number at the end of these sentences. Both of these writers do a really nice job of following the order. Punctuation, close quotes, then superscript. Your superscript is always outside. Always outside. One final piece of quoting that is really important is using block quotes. Sometimes it's necessary, depending upon what sources you're using, to quote a long piece of text. When we're quoting a long piece of text, a good rule of thumb is a quote of 5 or more lines should be turned into a block quotation. And what we do is we indent it and then single space it when the manuscript text around it is double spaced. And so when you create that block quote that's offset, you also don't need quote marks because it's understood that it is a quote. I always tell students to use block quotes sparingly. If you find yourself having a lot of really long quotes in your papers, think about how much balance there is between what you're saying about these sources and the sources themselves, and try to pull kernels from them more. Yes?
Are block quotations double-spaced or single-spaced?
Block quotations are single spaced. So the assumption is that you'll be writing in manuscript style with double spacing, and so then the block quote will be single spaced.
Okay, that's different. Malay.
Okay.
That's good to know.
Yeah, that's a really important. So you're going to be writing double spaced, and your block quote is going to be single spaced and then indented but flush.
Okay, thank you.
And again, you don't need the quote marks around your block quote. Another thing to note, and this is, I created this example actually to show this. Some block quotes, you may have a block quote that is starting a sentence after a sentence that ends, right? And so then you would capitalize the first letter of that sentence. You'll notice that this block quote is clearly taken from a sentence, right? And it follows, it's integrated into my sentence. He described the complex position of the free people because they, and then your quote begins, knew full well that. I do not capitalize the word knew because it's understood that that follows in the body of that sentence, but stylistically, it's blocked because the whole quote itself is very long. Is that clear? Okay. So now that we've talked a little bit about quoting, and we can have much longer conversations in a different time, I want to focus for the rest of our time here on sources themselves and citing those sources. So whenever you're working with sources, you want to make sure that you know what type of source it is, because that's also going to help you when consulting your citation guide to know how to cite it. But it's also a good way of thinking about the categories of sources you're using. So we talk about books, periodicals, journals, which may be accessed in print or electronic form, newspapers, print or electronic form, magazines, print or online form, websites, and then other kinds of sources that would be part of research. Most of the examples I use in this PowerPoint are books, and I think there's an example of dissertation in a newspaper, but we'll practice a little bit with some other sources. And know that Chicago style is a pattern, and when you don't know how to cite a certain kind of source, you go find that example in your Chicago guide and you mirror it. And there is a logic to the style, the structure of a footnote, and the structure of a bibliographic entry, that if you have a sense of that structure, you can also sometimes reasonably create a footnote from a kind of strange source that you may have as a historian. Whenever you're doing your writing, you want to know this basic source information. This is the foundation of your citation: the author, the title, and the publication information, including the date you accessed something on the internet. So always make sure you have this information for any source that you're working with. It's really, really important when you're writing to keep track of what you're drawing upon and make notes on that. And I'll come back to that a little bit in a moment. But you should have that general information for all the sources you're working with. And you can build a citation if you have that. This is a question I get from students, and it is a conversation that my colleagues and I have about whether we should use a citation management system. So I am a Luddite. I don't use a citation management system. I know some people love them. They love Zotero and EndNote. I took this advice directly from Chicago Manual, and I think it's good advice. Your citation management system is only as good as the data that you put into it. If you're misspelling the titles of books, if you're not putting in the full names of your authors, if your publication information is inaccurate, when you populate your manuscript with material from that software system, your citations are going to be incorrect. So be very, very careful when you're using a citation management system to double check your data, double check your citations in the paper themselves, and always back everything up. And so never let that citation management system rest on its own. You always want to be checking over your work. So now we get to the good stuff. Footnote and EndNote basics. So Chicago Notes bibliography system uses in any manuscript either footnotes or EndNotes and a bibliography. Every time a source is used in your text, it needs to be cited, either with a footnote or an EndNote. Footnotes appear at the bottom of the page. They're generally preferred in college level writing, and you'll see that theses and dissertations use footnotes. EndNotes are often preferred in professional manuscripts and published manuscripts, and one of the differences between a footnote and an EndNote is often the number for a footnote will be an Arabic number, an Arabic number, and the number for your EndNote will be a Roman numeral, a lowercase Roman numeral. You also see people using EndNotes with Arabic numbers, but is that right? Like, I don't think like normal numbers. I know there's a technical term, but yeah. Anyway. So I'm going to talk about footnotes because I generally don't see students using EndNotes or being expected to use EndNotes, but the same general rules apply. What's different is where the actual reference appears in relation to the text. So when you create an EndNote, the reference appears, all the references appear in a list at the end of your entire text before the bibliography. When you create a footnote, the reference goes at the bottom of the page. Couple general rules of thumb with footnotes. Your note number, which is a superscript number, which will correspond to a citation at the bottom of the page, that number should always appear at the end of the clause or the end of the sentence outside of any and all punctuation. This is really, really important. One of the common mistakes I see is people putting their footnote superscript number inside, basically, inside the punctuation. And I think that is a holdover from sometimes using parenthetical forms of citation. Don't do that. You should not be using any in-text or parenthetical citations when you're doing Chicago style. So I put some basics about using Microsoft Word. So different versions of Word sometimes have had different menus for creating footnotes, but I think the most recent version of Word is pretty uniform between Mac and PC versions. There is a difference between Word and Google Docs. So a couple different patterns, many patterns for this. When you're using Word now, you'll go to the References tab and choose Insert Footnote. Older versions have sometimes required you to go to the Insert tab and then say Footnote. There is a distinct References tab. One thing that you do not want to do is insert footer. Footer is a very different thing. A footer is a piece of text that will appear at the bottom of every single page of your manuscript. A footer is not a footnote. So you want to make sure if you're working with new software to figure out the menu sequence to add footnote. And if you're working with Word, it will reasonably be reference, insert, footnote. Google Docs, which I also use and many students use, is insert, and then you select footnote in that menu. Any questions about that? So I put two examples that show, these are my creations, that reflect common mistakes that I see in student work. So I want to actually see if we can identify the mistakes in these examples, and I'll use the pen to highlight some of them. So I'm going to open this up to everybody. What are some of the errors in these examples?
Is a parenthetical citation? Anchor page 1.
Yeah, so the first thing is we have a parenthetical citation right here. No. I think sometimes this happens because this is how we keep track of the sources we're using when we're writing, and then we don't go back and get rid of this in the final manuscript. Never have parenthetical citations in your finished work. And if possible, create those footnotes and put the references in the footnotes instead. Yes?
They're also not like footnoting every single time they're quoting. They're not adding in that footnote.
So in this example, the first example, it's fine. So in fact, so these quotes actually, these two sentences come from page 174 to 175. Putting the footnote at the end of the second quote, it is implicit that it reflects both of those quotes. So in that case, it's okay. Yeah? Aha, good catch. So a book title should always be italicized, right? Never put quotes around a book title. We put quotes around article titles, we put books around chapter titles, but we don't put quotes around book titles. Book titles are italicized.
I see a typo.
Yeah.
I pointed out the symbol in the footnote in
So
the first one.
proofreading. Good. So I think we've caught errors in that one. What about in the bottom one?
There's another parenthetical.
Yeah. So this is something I see where I think people don't know how to go insert footnote and are trying to create their own, and this is not correct. So you really want to figure out how to use your software to insert that superscript, because it will automatically create the corresponding space for the citation on the bottom of your page. Any other things that are weird about this one we need to catch? Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So this corresponds.
The author's name needs to be rearranged, yes?
Yeah. So the whole style of this citation, trying to figure out, the whole style of this citation is incorrect. So we have here a last name before first name. We're using wrong punctuation. We have a semicolon here, a semicolon here, semicolon here. We don't need to ever use semicolons within references. We're in a footnote, we use commas. I'll talk more about that. And we never need to put the last name first in a footnote because they're not organized alphabetically. So it always goes first name, then last name. Good job, proofreaders. All right, so what are some of the general patterns of a footnote? Well, the first thing is they're not organized alphabetically, so you're never going to start with a last name. So I'll walk you through some of the basic patterns. So when you create a footnote, you're generally listing all the components of your source, the author, if you have an author, the title, and all the facts of publication in that order. At the end, you would have a page number if you're referencing a page number in a source, and then you would have the URL at the very end if it's accessed online. footnote are separated by commas, and the facts of publication are enclosed in parentheses. You have the author's name presented in standard order. You capitalize titles, italicize titles of larger works, and put titles of smaller works like chapters or articles in quotation marks, and abbreviate these terms. Okay. The most important skill you will use when making your footnotes is figuring out how to mirror the model that you find in your citation guide. But this is a general pattern to use. Couple features of footnotes that are important to recognize. Footnotes can contain a lot of information. We sometimes joke that scholars will have a whole nother paper in their footnotes. But really, when you are, so say there are a couple sources that you need to cite that you are drawing upon in a particular sentence, you're going to only put one footnote at the end of that sentence and put all of those sources in the citation. So you can cite multiple sources in one footnote. And this is where you use your semicolon to separate those multiple citations. Okay, so you never need to put multiple footnotes on a sentence. You put one footnote at the end of the sentence and multiple citations in the footnote. You may also add commentary on a footnote, and that should come after your citations. Two other features of footnotes, and these are for simplicity's sake. Once you cite a source the first time, you can shorten the footnote in order to get rid of unnecessary text. And so we use a shortened citation form, which is usually the author's last name and a keyword version of the title, then followed by a page number. You can also use this little Latin abbreviation called IBID, which means in the same place, when the note above is the same source that you're citing. So let's look at some examples of how these things work. So what are some of the features of footnotes that we've just talked about that you see in these examples?
So the first one has like multiple sources.
Right, so the first one is actually a pretty good example of what we call bibliographic footnote. But yeah, it contains multiple sources, all separated by your semicolons. We've got books. We've also got a dissertation, which takes a slightly different format than a book. So dissertations are not for fully published text, and so the title of a dissertation is in italics, and you have this format for the publication information. Another thing you notice here, this is an example of your shortened form. This is a footnote that refers to, presumably this text was cited in a full form earlier in the paper, and so we use the shortened form of last name for fewer words in the title and then the page number. And the idea here is that I should be able to look at that and go into the bibliography and look for Stancil and know immediately get the full citation for that source. Here's an example of how you would add commentary. So this is your full citation followed by your commentary. Anyone know what this is? What number 25? What's going on there?
The newspaper.
Yep, so that's a newspaper. Exactly. So here are two different versions of the same set of sentences. Which is correct and why? Version 2 is correct. Anyone want to dispute that?
shouldn't say one just because of the names, like the first name comes first.
So yeah, so this is a big sign, right? You never need to start with the last name in a footnote. Always do first name, last name. So that's one clue.
So when you're doing like you always put the period after it, even when you're doing the page number after.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep, because it's an abbreviation, right? So another thing you should notice here is you've got full citation for Carol Smith Rosenberg's book. And then clearly these are citations that reflect subsequent references to the same book, so you use IBID. So this is as the above, page 39. This means Carol Smith Rosenberg, page 39, right? So that's the correct progression there. What I think happens is we didn't do some revision to our footnotes, right? So we've got the full citation here and then shortened citation here. Good rule of thumb when you're writing, don't use IBID, because when you revise, if you move text around, you're going to have a problem. I have done this to myself, and it is not a pretty situation. What text was that? Whenever you're creating your footnotes, just say what the text is, and then when you go back and you're polishing your manuscript, whether to submit it to your advisor, to submit it for your final grade, or to submit it to a publisher, then you can put in your IBIDs.
I have a question
Yeah.
about the previous slide. The footnote that had commentary, use that. When do you decide to do that instead of like putting it in the paper?
When do you decide to use commentary? So a couple of reasons. In this case, so this is actually a paper that I wrote, I make a reference to an argument that Barbara Cutter makes in her book, but it's not necessary to go in depth about what her critique of Stansell's work is for the purpose of the paper. But I want to give my reader a little bit more information about that critique. So in order to retain the flow of the narrative in my paper, I took that additional information, which I still think is relevant to the paper itself, and moved it into the footnote. And so that's actually a revision strategy people use, is what in this content is essential to the narrative and what is extra. Can I get rid of that? Or is it still useful for my reader? And then you move that into a footnote. So here's another set of samples. Which version is correct and why? Any guesses? You don't have to be right. That's why we're here.
I think it's one.
1. Yes, 1 is correct. What suggested that to you?
In the second version, there's a period after Palmer. You don't want to put a period after the author's name every footnote.
Correct. So don't have parentheses here, right? We use parentheses in a footnote. We also don't have the full title of the book, right? This is a case where you want to go back in and make sure in your first full footnote for a text, you include the full title, including the subtitle. I was expecting that this would throw people off. This is government document citation style. This is a case where if you are drawing on government documents, you're going to follow the citation style for government documents no matter what the discipline of the paper you are writing. And so there is a whole other set of citation rules that you're going to want to familiarize yourself with that I don't know, but I follow the pattern when I created this footnote. Another thing that's important about this one is here we have the URL, but we don't have the access date. Okay, so you put in and make sure there's an access date associated with that URL. And the reason we have an access date is because you may not have a stable, not all URLs are stable, and so you want your reader to know when you access that material in case it goes away, right? When did you get that information? Or if something changes. So I've included the Chicago style guidelines for citing legal. If you go in Chicago manual online, you can find the link and it goes into greater detail about how to do this. But you want to follow the form of citation in legal works and when you're using those types of sources in a history paper. So electronic sources. So Chicago recommends that whenever you're drawing from internet sources, you include a uniform resource locator or URL as the final element in the citation. I really want to underscore that a URL by itself is never sufficient. It's never sufficient because you don't have author, title, publication information. If that's not there, your citation isn't complete. So never just use a URL. There's this thing called the digital object identifier, which I have just learned about, which is a much more stable way of identifying a source, and you'll often see these on online journals. So if a DOI is available, use that instead of a URL. Another guideline from Chicago is that if you have a URL that points to a location that is a subscription, so if you're using a subscription to Ancestry.com or to a searchable database that may not be accessible, you don't need to provide a URL, just identify the database. So ProQuest is enough. So this is an example of how you would cite, in this case, an ebook, but this is a Google Books. And so you take the URL and then an access date, put that at the end so you have all the components of your citation, comma, your URL, and then accessed in parentheses. So I wanted to give us a chance to practice this a little bit, and maybe we may have time at the end, but I thought what we could do with this is to pull out all the different components of this journal article that you would need to do a citation. So we need to start with our author right here. We have a comma, then we have our title here. Would the title be italicized or in quotes? In quotes, right. Then we have the journal title itself. Here's your journal title. Then you'd have your volume and number. This stays in parentheses. I'll show you on the citation guide in a moment. And your page numbers. In a footnote, would you have the full run of pages of the article, or would you put the page number that you are drawing from?
Just the one you're drawing.
Just the one you're drawing from, unless you're including this article in like a bibliographic footnote. Any other information that we want in this footnote? The DOI, right. So this is an example where you have a DOI and you have a URL. Chicago recommends that you use the DOI if it's available, and you do just like that, DOI, colon, and then this. Okay. Right. I want to make sure we talk about bibliography so we can come back and do some practice. So if there's a particular form that you're confused about, we can go over. The handout, you have 2 pages handout. So it generally has the basic content that I've been walking us through. What you see is I took some of the most common types of sources you may be using from the quick guide, and I put that here. And so this is an example where you'd want to use those components and then mirror that in your citation. I want to talk about bibliography. So you should never not include a bibliography. A bibliography is an alphabetized list of all the sources cited in a text. And that may also include relevant sources that are not directly cited. That's a judgment call you need to make.
Could you say a little more about that? What you would, because that's not common for people only used to MLA.
I wish I had a better answer except to say that sometimes there may be books that are informing what you're doing, that there's no place in your text to really cite them, but you want to include them because they were part of your research. You know, I wish I could give a more firm hypothetical, except that I've done that. But I think it's also good to say, okay, why don't I have this cited in the body of my text? Is there a place where is there a footnote that it should be in? But you know, like actually, this is a good example. So this may be something with primary sources. You may have looked at a collection and you don't actually cite any features of that collection in the text itself, but it's a collection that was part of the research of the project. So you may have that in your bibliography. So I think that's actually probably a more common example of like the list of archive collections that you drew on.
That's really good to know because that's really different from MLA when we emphasize that if it's in works cited, it has to be cited in the body of the paper and vice versa. If it's cited in the body of the paper, it has to be in the works cited page.
Yeah, I mean, I think the rule of thumb here is if it's cited, it has to be in the bibliography, but there may be things in the bibliography depending upon I think scale of the project is relevant. I think you're more likely in a dissertation to have sources in the bibliography that may not be cited, or in a monograph. Not to sort of start splitting hairs, but for example, when you're citing sources from a manuscript collection, in the bibliography, you're not going to actually have every single one of those letters that you cited. You're going to have the collection that those letters are from. So that's another place where you'd have a difference, right? But that has to do with the nature of those manuscript sources. So when you're creating a bibliography, so in your footnotes, your footnote is always the first line is indented. Bibliography, it's the reverse. You have a hanging indent, which means that any lines that the bibliographic entry goes on past the first are indented. Couple key differences in formatting. This is an alphabetized list, alphabetized by author's last name, so you always have the author's last name, comma, first name. And if you have multiple authors, either follow the order of the authors on the book itself, or best bet, go with alphabetical. The elements of the entry are separated by periods rather than commas, and the facts of publication are not enclosed in parentheses. And no page numbers are given because you're putting the book as a whole. When you have a chapter or a journal article, you'll have the full run of page numbers included in that citation. And if you have multiple successive references for an author in a bibliography, the author's name and those subsequent references can be replaced with what we call an M dash, basically a long dash. So looking at this format style, is this a footnote citation or a bibliographic entry? Footnote, yep. You know immediately because first name, last name. Yep, and you have your parentheses, and you have commas, and you have page numbers. These are all clues. This is footnote. So what I've done here is taken two of those sources and show how they would transform from your footnote into your bibliographic entry. Notice the order of the name is changed. You have periods between each element, no parentheses. Okay, notice that change. This is an example of an article a chapter in an edited collection. And so this is a case where you have your author, title of the article, comma, in, title of the edited collection, comma, and remember in your footnote you abbreviate, EDS, period, and then your editors, and then the publication information. In the footnote, you have periods between the elements, so therefore this is capitalized because it comes after a period, and then edited by is spelled out. Here's the one kind of squiffy thing. The page number run is included here, right? It doesn't go at the end. It goes after all the information about the book itself. So this is an example of where you want to go in and find that sample in your citation guide and make sure you're mirroring it. Okay. So one of the things I'm emphasizing here is that it's good to know the patterns, but you're never going to be able to correctly and completely cite your work without consulting your guide. So when you have larger projects, like a master's thesis, dissertation, monograph project, you may divide your bibliography into sections, and Chicago is painfully vague about the exact way to do this, except to only do this in a way that makes the reader's job significantly easier. The common way that you would see someone subdivide a bibliography is between published secondary sources, books and journal articles, and your primary sources, like your manuscript sources, archival collections, or other materials. And one of the reasons for that is they may not fit comfortably into a straight alphabetical list. If you pick up any book that you're reading in your history class, you'll notice that it will probably divide its bibliography this way. You'll often see not only division between your primary and secondary sources, but also different categories of sources. So one of the things that Chicago says that I found really interesting is they recommend not dividing your secondary sources between articles and books, because then you wind up having scholarship written by the same author in different sections of your bibliography, and that's not a good idea. And so I thought that was worth mentioning. But these are the kind of decisions that a writer is going to make, and you want to be clear and you want to be consistent. But again, this is usually for larger projects. Okay, so we've got about 10 minutes, and so I thought we could use that time to ask questions about different categories of sources, or if we want to actually practice doing this with different types of sources, we can talk through that as well. Yes.
I know this isn't like related to the presentation, really.
That's fine.
When would you use the other form of Chicago? Like, I never know what to do.
So, so social sciences. I mean, I have never run across it in my discipline. Yeah. So if you're a historian, you're using notes bibliography. You're not using author date.
What about over in fine arts, though?
I don't believe so. I mean, my understanding is that art historians, music historians are using notes bibliography.
So we didn't need to create a video on how to set up
No.
an author date.
No, and again, I just may not be aware, but I've never, yeah.
Good to know.
Yeah. So one thing that I thought I would mention is when say you're working with a source in your class that is like a collection, an edited collection for teaching purposes, and you're trying to figure out how to cite those. So I use these a lot in my classes, and you have excerpts from primary and secondary sources. And within them, but you'll see at the bottom, there is the full citation of where that original source comes from. The couple things to think about with that. The best practices for Chicago style are how you got a source is important, right? So if you didn't actually, I've opened this up to Jonathan Boucher's Loyalist Sermon from 1797. I'm not actually looking at a printed copy of Jonathan Boucher's Loyalist Sermon. I'm looking at an excerpt from his sermon in Major Problems in American Religious History. So if my citation doesn't include the book that source is included in, it's not an accurate citation. And the way that Chicago wants us to handle that is actually to handle it like you would a chapter in an edited collection. So the key here is you can nest. Okay. Any other questions?
Is do you recommend going to the Purdue OWL?
Yes,
Questions?
Purdue OWL is great. Purdue OWL is good. What am I doing? Discard annotations. I find that this answers most of my questions. I really, really like this. It's very straightforward. It's very comprehensive. One of the things I like about it, with the 17th edition, you have your ebook, how to cite an ebook. Another thing they have here, they show how to include your DOIs, and this would be an example where it comes from a database, so you don't need to include a DOI or a URL, but you, and so that's the choice that person made. But I actually think this is from Project Muse, so you probably could use a stable URL, but they're showing it. I mean, you want to be consistent, but there is some room for making choices.
So if you do an indirect source like you were talking about, what would you do for like the date, I guess?
Well, so yeah, so there are, actually, I'm going to do this. So there are a couple ways of approaching this, and I think the one that is, it matters, right? Also, I think who you're writing for, right? Audience matters. So if you're producing a thesis, and so I just opened up my book to an essay, an excerpt from a book. If I'm doing my thesis on anti-Catholicism in the early 19th century, I should not be using my major problems textbook. I should be getting Charles Morris's book, American Catholic, right? But if I'm writing a paper for my American religion class and I'm citing this, I would do it this way. I would say Charles Morris. So that's the title of the section of the book itself.
So then it's everything after that about the book.
The
that
book
you
itself,
wrote from.
exactly.
So you don't have to put the author. Well, okay, that makes
No,
sense.
exactly,
Yeah.
right.
Okay.
Exactly. But again, right, this is a place where part of what you're doing when you're citing is you're demonstrating your sources, your research, your knowledge of your field. If you're producing a larger piece of scholarship, whether it's a capstone paper or journal article or master's thesis, you should be drawing on the original book, right, the original source to the best of your ability. Another example I thought I could potentially show to illustrate this is, I brought it, but I can just get it. So this is a common, professors often use these online primary source excerpts, and you may be using this in a paper. So here is an excerpt from a primary source, and here's the full, the original citation for this source. But if you're going to cite this, you're going to cite it as something that appears on this website, right? Because it's important that if your citation mirrors this, you're not actually representing where your source is from. You're misrepresenting that research, right? So you need to make sure that Samson Occam used this title, and then this is where it's being published, and you have your URL, and you want to add your access date, so that then your professor can go back and find this site, right? Because you didn't do this research, right? And this is, again, an example where the level that you're at matters, right? When you're, again, doing a paper in a course, it will be appropriate to consult something like this. But at a higher level, you'd want to go to, oh my goodness, I can't remember the name of Dartmouth, and Dartmouth collections and find the actual digitized short narrative that they have and draw on that, right?
That's great.
Any final questions? So I hope I've given you a sense of why the system works the way it does and some of the questions you should be asking as you're making sure you're citing correctly. But I'd be glad to answer any questions outside of the context of this workshop if you have them. So thanks.